One of the great privileges that we're entitled to in this great land is freedom of speech, the ability to speak our minds without fear of governmental repercussions or reprisal. A friend of mine who emigrated from the Soviet Union told me they also had freedom of speech in the former Soviet Republic. He said, freedom before the speech, Siberia after it. You know, that's maybe one of the reasons that so many immigrants, particularly those from Russia who come to America, value and appreciate the freedoms that we have here. And somebody who has not only appreciated that freedom, but is helping others to appreciate that freedom through being proactive in some of the bills that he is passing, is newly elected Senator David Storobin. He's the only Jewish Republican elected in New York State, and he's New York City. New York City. And he's entered into the fray in a number of areas. Now, there are 33 Republicans to 29 Democrats in the state, and according to the senator, that's why he entered into the race in order to push through not his agenda, but the agenda of those who he feels are in his community that want to have a fair shake. One of the things that he has done is he has sponsored the repeal of the Blaine Amendment, and that's sending a very strong message to Albany. Talking to us about what the repeal of the Blaine Amendment is Senator David Storobin. Thanks for joining us here on Front and Center.
Thank you for having me.
Tell me a little bit about, first of all, what the Blaine Amendment is and why you feel it's important to sponsor a bill that would repeal it.
Well, for all intents and purposes, what a Blaine Amendment is it prevents the government from funding school vouchers. At its most basic, at its core, that's what it is. That's why it was passed. And our families, in particular in our district, where we have a lot of families with seven or eight kids, are not able to afford to send their kids to private schools, and really they cannot send their kids to public schools either, because their kids do need religious education. So they're caught in a position where they have to choose between religion and putting food on the table. Mm-hmm. A lot of the families. And the reality is that even if you're a middle-class person, not just a poor person, being able to afford education for several people is a tremendous hardship. A tremendous hardship. And they do pay taxes, and they are citizens, and they do have all the same rights that everyone else has, except they do not get the benefit of their taxes in terms of educational benefit. At this point, the New York State spends about $18,000 per student in public school. The proposal that I have is that the government would pay at least half of that to people who choose to take their kids out of public schools and put them in private schools, which would actually be a net benefit to the government. And parents would have a choice. Do they want to send their child to a public school or to a private school? If you like your public school, if you think that it provides the education that you want your children to have, you're welcome to continue doing that. But on the other hand, you will have the option of taking that $9,000 and going to a private school and seeing if they are going to accept your child. I think that will be a tremendous help for our district, but I think beyond our district, there are so many schools, public schools, that are really bad. You see metal detectors, you see kids getting arrested, you see drug dealers in the schoolyards, and a lot of parents, they have no choice but to send their child into what is essentially a crime spree. One big crime spree with guns and knives and drugs and prostitution and everything else. What we need to do is we need to save those children, while at the same time also we would be able to help religious children and to help so many of our families. And that's why we need a repeal of the Blaine Amendment. Blaine Amendment prevents it. The Blaine Amendment is something that is the brainchild of the school unions, which I can understand why they would want to prevent parents from sending their kids to private schools, because they would lose membership. There would still be the same number of teachers, but because you would have fewer teachers in public school and more teachers in private schools, they would lose membership. Having said that, my main concern is not making sure that the leadership of a labor union is able to benefit from union dues. My main concern is to make sure that the child who's in a crime spree that they call a school is not going to get killed. My main concern is to make sure that that family that wants to send a child to a yeshiva or a Catholic school or any other kind of a religious school, that they're able to follow their religious beliefs without having to take food off their tables. My main concern are the families and the children, not some union leader.
It sounds to me, after only 3 weeks in office, you've really hit the trail swinging with both fists. Now, within this short time, the Blaine Amendment is not the only one that you've taken on, but you also introduced, I think, over 30 bills you sponsored in 3 weeks. Is that true?
That is true. I decided I'm going to come in and make a difference in Albany. We've sponsored or co-sponsored that many bills. Individually, I was the chief sponsor in 6 bills, and there were also 30-some bills that we've co-sponsored with other people, such as Senator Golden and Senator Savino and so on, making sure that we work across the aisle, with both Republicans and Democrats for things like funding for the special needs children, funding for busing, funding for mandated services in schools, and not just educational programs. Incidentally, I'm sure you've heard there was a case of a kid, Libby, who was kidnapped and murdered. So one of the laws that we introduced is to, one, bring back the death penalty. Two is to allow the judge, in cases where a child is not killed but is kidnapped, the judge would have the opportunity to give life imprisonment to somebody who's a child kidnapper, which I think is very important. And I think we need to protect our children. I think we need to protect, again, our families. And we can't continue to have what's essentially a revolving door where somebody who kidnaps a child goes in there for a year or 2 or 3 or 4, and then they come out and then they commit the same crime again. Beyond that, another pressing need is obviously our economy. And you have a lot of bureaucracy. I mean, I was talking to a friend of mine. He owns several pharmacies, and he was telling me that in the 1990s, when he opened his first pharmacy, it took him a month and a half. When he opened his last pharmacy just recently, it took him a year and a half.
Why is that?
Because of government bureaucracy, because you can't get anything done. Another friend of mine, he owns a restaurant. It took him about 8 months, more than 8 months, just to get his liquor license.
No wonder it took us so long to get served.
Exactly. But the reality is that we do need our businesses to grow. And the only way that will happen is if the government doesn't harm them. It doesn't harm them in terms of tax policy, and doesn't harm them in terms of bureaucracy. Obviously, we need to make sure that we have the right permits and licensing. Obviously, we need to have a tax base. Having said that, we need to make sure that our businesses, especially small businesses, are able to survive. Without helping our businesses, we will not be able to recover. 70% of all the new jobs in the United States, as well as in New York State, are created by small businesses. The mom and pop stores, the coffee shops, the restaurants, the grocery stores, the shoe stores, and so on. If we prevent those businesses from flourishing, our economy will never recover, which is why I proposed several tax cuts, which are very targeted to help our economy. I've proposed to reduce some of the bureaucracy. For example, one bill that we've co-sponsored, in a supermarket, if they decide to have one little corner where they also, sell cooked, prepared food, and you're able to sit down and eat it there like in a restaurant, nobody suffers. I don't see a victim in this. So why is it that the government makes it almost impossible to allow for that? It takes 2 years or something just to make that happen.
Why?
For no apparent reason. Just because of bureaucracy, just because a bureaucrat needs a job, apparently.
You keep saying bureaucracy. Not sometimes it could be just because of the way the mics are. I'm hearing bureaucracy as well. Do I understand from what you've stated so far, and consistent with everything else, that you would consider yourself to be a conservative more than you would be a Republican, or do you want to defy those labels?
Well, what's important is obviously helping people, because, like I said, it's important to work across the aisle, but I am a conservative. So when it comes to social policy, fiscal policy, with fiscal policy, I've seen what liberal policies have done to the Soviet Union. I've seen where that led. Incidentally, that nation now has another word in front of it. That word is former. It doesn't exist anymore. It's now the former Soviet Union for a reason. The United States won the Cold War predominantly because it had the right economic policies. And we need to not go away from the American way and embrace the Soviet way. We need to actually do the opposite. We need to embrace the very ideals that Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and all those people who founded the United States, all their ideas need to be embraced. On social policy, again, we're talking about basic common sense. A marriage between a man and a woman, for thousands of years, for tens of thousands of years, seemed like common sense. You look at societies that really had no contact with each other until the last couple hundred years. Australia and South America and Africa and Europe and Asia and every single continent. They didn't necessarily have contact with each other, and yet they all came up with the same idea of a family, in completely independently, which tells you something that, over the course of time, you realize what works and what doesn't, and this is what worked. And all of a sudden, in the last 2 years, you have people coming in and saying, look, all those generations of people, hundreds and hundreds of generations, they don't understand anything. They don't know anything. We are the smart ones here. And we will change everything, and we got it right and everyone else got it wrong. Well, the reality is that this experiment has played itself out in other nations as well. Ancient Greece had it, and ancient Egypt at one point had it. There are many.
These are not
cultures.
exactly the top ranked nations today in terms of civilization, right?
Well, it's not even that, but they all rejected it. All of them rejected it. Sooner or later, they all came to believe that what makes sense is a man and a woman marrying each other. All of them rejected this experiment. This is not the first time that somebody came up with a brilliant new idea that nobody has thought of before.
Yeah,
it's a rejected old idea.
That's right, except it's the first time that they've decided now that they actually want to legitimize it. It's a pity. I know that you're representing New York, but it's a pity that you weren't with us in Trenton, where I was covering the story when they were voting on the same gender bill, and I was appalled and amazed, as were other people there. We were in the gallery, I was covering the story, and as people would get up defending the bill as though, and they said explicitly, that it's a civil right. So one person got up and said it's a civil wrong. But is it going to take people in the legislature, people like yourself, that are going to stand up and actually not couch the words and say that it is not a civil right? Would you go that far?
Yes, I would go that far. Like I said, this is a failed experiment. It's not a civil right. And we need to make sure that we stick to what actually worked for so many generations, hundreds of generations. Everything that the left takes on is a civil right. Every policy, social and fiscal, incidentally, is a civil right. Because they were obviously very successful, and rightfully so, in the 1960s, in large part also with the help of the Republican Party. Nobody remembers it now, but in 1964, when the Civil Rights Bill was passed, Republicans supported more than Democrats. Al Gore's father, who was a senator at the time, United States Senator, he opposed the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Republicans were very much in favor of it at the congressional level and so on. We should also remember that the Ku Klux Klan was essentially a military wing of the Democratic Party at the time. It was not a Republican organization at all. I've never heard of any Republicans being members of the Ku Klux at the time, being members of the Ku Klux Klan. And when one member, David Duke, decided to join the Republican Party, he was roundly condemned. Whereas when
it's considered an aberration, nobody would take it.
When a Klansman, what's his name?
Senator Byrd.
Senator Byrd, yeah. When he decided that he was going to join the Democratic Party, he became one of the highest elected officials to this day in the Democratic Party. People may say that, he may have changed his views. The reality is that we probably don't want somebody who, at least at one point, was a Klansman.
It's very interesting in listening to you and hearing the scope and breadth of your understanding of American history. One would think that you were born and raised in America and studied, American history right from high school textbooks. But in fact, you were born and raised in Russia. You didn't come to this country until you were 7 years old.
12.
12 years old. So perhaps, if you would, just before we get back on the political track, maybe you just let us know a little bit more about David Storobin, private citizen, before he entered the realm of politics. You have your own law firm. You've been very active in the legislative arena for a while before you entered into the political fray. So tell us a little bit, if you would, about your own background, your parents, when you left Soviet Russia, and what brought you to where you are right now. Was that okay? You don't mind me doing that?
No, I don't. The Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times. That kind of is my life, especially in the Soviet Union when in the mid to late 1980s, where the country was falling apart, and there was really no control over anything at one point, and so you would see crime break out, tremendous levels of crime beyond anything that you would expect. You would see food just disappear. You would see.
This was in the stores. That somebody once said that the stores, the supermarkets, were the same size in Russia as they were in America. The only difference was there wasn't any food in them.
Well, there was a joke at the time. They pretend to pay us and we pretend to work.
Yeah.
You know, because they stopped paying people. There was another joke where somebody said, a man walks into a store and asked, "Is this a store where you sell meat?" And the seller goes, "This is a store where we don't have fish. The store where they don't have meat is across the street." Because you would walk in.
Unfortunately, it wasn't just a joke. It had turned out to be true.
Oh yeah, it absolutely was true. I mean, I remember, not seeing anything in a store. I mean, literally, you would walk in and there was nothing on the shelves, whether it's food or clothes or anything else. Every single summer, my mom and I, we would go. My parents had divorced, so she didn't have anyone else to go with, so she would take me. We would go to Moscow because that was the only place where you would actually be able to buy anything. She would put me in the back of the line, and then she would go to the front of the line to try to figure out what they were selling. And this was a 2 or 3 hour line. In the last 40 minutes or so, nobody knew what they were selling. So I would stand there, and she would be gone for 10, 15 minutes. And then she'd come back, and she would say, "Look, we don't need any vodka." So all the time that I stood in line was for nothing. Or on occasion, I distinctly remember standing in line, and it was women's shoes, and she needed women's shoes. However, by the time we got to the front, the only shoes that they had available was about size 14 or 15, which not too many ladies need. So in a normal country, you would just say, "Don't need them." In the Soviet times, she bought them. She wound up trading them several times over and over for some other goods that she may not necessarily needed, until she got something that she could actually use. So those goods became almost like a stock or gold or something like that, where you don't really need it, but you buy it and you trade it for something else. Beyond that, I lived in a place that was not particularly safe. It was right next door to Chechnya, which our place actually broke out before Chechnya did, and in particular against the Jews. So my grandmother's brother was tortured to death for being Jewish. And I knew him very well. In fact, we were supposed to visit him that night. We were waiting for the bus, and it was raining. And so at one point, my mom said, "Look, we'll just go home if our bus to our home arrives at that point." So the bus to our house came first, and we boarded that bus. And in the morning, we found out that he was tortured to death. So we were supposed to be there. But then a year and a half later, when I was 11, in July 1990, somebody was in our backyard trying to break into our house, and they got arrested. I was there with my mom and my grandfather. Grandfather. Yeah, my grandma was in the hospital at the time. They were trying to break in. What they were going to do is they were going to iron me. You know how you iron clothes? That's what they did to quite a few children there, to the Jewish children where we were.
You saw this? You were aware of it?
I was very, very aware of this. We didn't. After that, I left. I didn't leave Russia for another 15, 16 months.
What year was this?
1989, 1991.
As recently as 1991?
That's when it broke out. It wasn't that bad before. And then when Russia lost control, it was, well, all Jews are rich, let's go take their money. And when it turned out that
Even in a communist society, what they took away, they held that was worth something also.
Well, there is a belief that all Jews are very wealthy, regardless of what you may have. Even if it's a single mother with a child, they still believe that there's a belief that all Jews have unlimited amounts of money. So when they would come in and they would try to and they would demand that you turn over your money, they would demand money that nobody has. So when people were not able to give it up, they thought, oh, it's Jews who are cheap, they're not doing it, so if we torture them, then they will give up the money, which is what happened to my great uncle. He was robbed first. They didn't find anything significant. Then they came in, then they tortured him, and it was 4 hours of torture. He was 70 years old at the time, and at the end of the 4 hours, they just killed him.
How old was he?
70.
My goodness.
He just filed his papers to retire. He didn't retire until the age of 70. He was eligible to retire for the previous 10 years. He kept on working.
A tragedy.
And he just put in his papers to retire. And about a month before he was going to, relax for the first time in his life, this is how we came to the United States. We submitted all that paperwork, and the United States, we submitted it in February of '91, and not even March 24th. I actually remember the date. We received papers saying come in for an interview in the American embassy, and the American government does not usually operate that quickly. But when they saw the documents, and these are all police reports, these were not our stories, they really responded very, very quickly. Within a month and a half, we had documents to come to the American embassy for an interview, and then they told us what day we can come to the United States.
America responding in the way that we would hope that it would, and
Yeah.
in its outreach and its kindness and its mercy toward immigrants, which has its pros and its cons, but in this case it certainly had its pros. So that's what you left behind. Now,
That is what I left behind, and we came here, and at the time you were legally allowed to take $100 out of Russian per person, so we had $200.
And it's not like you had $100,000 sewed in your coat pocket or anything like that.
No,
This
it
was
was
all you
impossible to bring anything. We had somebody, we came to Dallas at first, and in Dallas, the local Jewish community took us in, and they paid our rent the first 4 months. They picked us up from the airport. I remember we came out of the airplane, and we were excited we're in the United States. Your first thought is like, oh my God, we came to the United States. And at that point, I remember looking at my mom, and all of a sudden, the smile went away, and then she went, "Now what?"
Now what?
Because there's no one there. Like, we had no relatives
It's not like
there.
you were coming, right? You weren't coming to family with open arms.
No, there was
waiting for you.
nobody.
Welcome to America. Here now, you're here. It's like
We're in the airport. Like imagine going to Mongolia or something, or some place that you know nothing about, and you get out of the airplane, and you're like, "Oh, very nice. I'm in Mongolia. Now what?"
So now what? What happened?
Somebody comes over and they say our last name, and they're speaking English, and we don't know English. I knew a couple hundred words maybe. My English was more or less the same as the Spanish of somebody who took Spanish in high school or in junior high school for a year or two. But I understood my last name, and I said yes, and they took our bags and they began carrying them. And at one point, we began walking after them, and my mom says, "They might be kidnapping us, but we have no choice right now." So they put us in the car, and they drove. Well, we weren't afraid, because what were they going to kidnap us for? It wasn't like they were going to get a ransom. So they drove us to an apartment that the local Jewish community rented for us, and it was paid for the next 4 months, and it had, a refrigerator full of food, and it even had some clothes and, everything. The next day, somebody else came, and a Jewish couple came, and they said that they will take us to a supermarket to show us what's what, because in addition to everything else, the packaging is very different in the Soviet Union and the United States. So even if you have the money to buy sugar, you don't know what it looks like. People were coming out of the woodworks to help us with everything. I mean, Dallas doesn't have public transportation, so people were just driving us, random people. I got braces for free by some orthodontists who just volunteered to do this. It was really great there, but the problem with Dallas, well, first off, they only do it for the first 4 months, and then you got to get on your own. Mm-hmm. The problem with Dallas is that it doesn't have public transportation, or it doesn't run very often, let's put it this way. So you need a car. But we don't have money for the cars, and you can't get a job without a car, and you can't get a car without a job, so it's cheaper to buy a plane ticket to New York where there's public transportation. So we wound up coming to the United States. We rented an apartment on 18th Avenue.
Came to New York, yeah.
I'm sorry, to New York. Rented an apartment on 18th Avenue. The first meal we had there were leftovers from the previous tenant who just moved out that morning. And then a couple of days later, and then the super brought in some food next day. So basically, that's how we ate, off of other people's rachmanos. Then somebody else came from a shul. They brought us some food for Pesach, because by that point it was Pesach already. A month into coming, exactly to a day, a month after coming to New York, my mom and I were sitting in our kitchen. There's no furniture. I mean, we had a couple chairs, but not much else. There's no light, literally dark in there. And my mom says, well, we'll be homeless because we can't afford to pay rent this month. At which point, just as she says it, somebody knocks on the door, and I go to the door, and it's a Hasidic man whom I've met by accident. And he says, does your mother want to work? And I said, yes, because I'm pretty sure she doesn't care anymore what kind of a job it is. She'll take anything.
And she had been trained as a medical
She was a medical school professor, in the Soviet Union.
She had a medical school professor. One has to have a medical
tenure,
degree.
Everything.
Tenure, I mean, that's already a physician.
Well, in the Soviet Union it was different. You were trained specifically to teach in medical school, so
somebody who was high-ranking in the field.
Very high-ranking, exactly. So she had a good job, very respected job, but in the United States she doesn't speak English. One reason we moved into Borough Park is that she speaks Yiddish.
Right.
And that made it easier to communicate with people. We could have moved into Brighton Beach, but everyone there was looking for a $5 an hour job, so there wasn't. You don't want to go to a place with no supply and a lot of demand. So I figured there might be some demand and a little less. I'm sorry, the supply of labor over in Borough Park. So my mom came up and she spoke in Yiddish. I don't really understand Yiddish. I just know a few words, but I don't understand it. And she turned to me and she said, they offer me so much money. They offer me $5 an hour. Because at the time the minimum wage was $4.25, and she wasn't even hoping to get more than minimum wage. She was working there part-time. She was, watching after the children and cleaning the apartment. And after a while, she got another job for $6 an hour. So then she got a job working in a pharmacy. Then she got a job as a social worker. The same year she got a job as a social worker, I wound up going to law school. And that's really how we climbed out of poverty, because we wound up. My mom also went to school at the time, which made it very difficult for her, to be a mother, essentially, because she would leave home at 8 o'clock in the morning. She would work until 6. She would go to school from 6 to 10. She'd come home tired. She would cook, and that's about that. And on my end, the reality is that if you were 13 years old or 14 years old and nobody's home to check your homework, you don't do your homework. Right?
So you didn't do your homework?
So I didn't do my homework until I was maybe 16, 17 years old, until we were talking about me.
Did you at least get a late note?
Late note.
Getting any homework 3 years later? I mean.
Yeah, so I wound up I wound up getting not the greatest grades my first couple of years in high school.
That I tell people I wasn't in the top half of my class, but I wasn't the part that made the top half possible.
Yeah.
Okay, so how did you get from not such great grades to getting into law school?
Well, that's the whole thing, that when I declared I was 14, 15 years old that I'm going to be a lawyer and my grades are terrible and everyone were just laughing at me, it's like, you're not going to be a lawyer, you'll be lucky just to go to college, because you need to do homework to become a lawyer someday. So after a while, you mature and you start realizing that poverty is not where you want to stay for the rest of your life. And poverty is where you're going to stay because if you don't get an education. So I went to college, I went to law school. I worked for a law firm, and when I was 25, I decided I'm going to start my own firm, which was yet another time when somebody told me you're guaranteed to fail because nobody's going to hire a 25-year-old lawyer. Beyond that, I also didn't have the money to create a law firm. So I wound up maxing out my credit cards, which years later I told my mom about it. I told her that this is how I started the law firm. And despite the fact that the law firm was already standing on its own, I had no loans anymore, nothing, my mom still almost had a heart attack that I would ever consider doing it. It's the only time that I ran up my credit cards, but it was necessary for me to start my own business. Around the time, years before then actually, when I was 14 years old, I saw Rudy Giuliani in Borough Park. He came there to campaign when he ran for mayor the second time, when he won the first time. And I was very inspired by him, and he turned around and he said, anybody who wants to volunteer, this is Dov Heiken's office right behind us. Come into the office and please help me. So I walked in, I worked through Dov's office at the time, and then I helped out George Pataki the next year. I helped out Giuliani again when he ran the second time, when he ran for re-election. And I've worked for a lot of other campaigns between 1993 and today. In 2009, I became the vice chair of the Republican Party in Brooklyn, and that was the time that I got really involved at a little bit higher level than just a volunteer. And about a year ago, I decided to start talking to people about running for the Senate seat, which just as with me saying that I'll be a lawyer or I will start my own firm, people's response was, "You'll never get the nomination." So
So you've
for
been a
more than
contrarian straight through, which is actually the hallmark of a lot of very successful people.
Yeah.
Just when they say you can't do it, you shouldn't do it. I have a friend who's a very wealthy individual who said people are always telling him what he couldn't do,
yeah.
but he knew what the right thing to do was, and he went ahead and he's one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the country today.
You have to listen to people, but you also have to listen to yourself. And when people were telling me you can't get the nomination, then when I got the nomination you can't win, then and before that, like I said, with my law firm, with my being a lawyer and everything else, you got to do what you think is right, both morally and in terms of practical ability to achieve something. And this is what gets me to the bills that I've introduced, school vouchers and repeal of gay marriage and so on and so forth. I don't care about people telling me that it's impossible. How could it be impossible to pass school vouchers when 70% of the New York State is in favor of school vouchers? When most of the senators and assemblymen are running in districts where the majority of their electorate supports school vouchers. How in the world is that impossible? But they all have to respond to their electorate.
Right.
Not only that, but let me put it this way. There's a reason why they're saying that it's impossible. Because if we put that vote on the floor, this politician has to make a choice. Does he take the money from the labor union, or does he go with the people of his district? If you say it's impossible, you can say, hey, I'm the good guy, and everyone else is the bad guy. You take the money from the school unions, and then you tell your people, look, it's just impossible, so what's the difference?
That is what some people would call politics.
That is what some people would call politics. That is also what some people would call chutzpah, and that's also what some people would say is the reason why why people hate politicians. That is the actual reason, because they want to play games. And what we need to do and what I'm fighting for is to introduce this bill, to put it on the floor, and to put it up for a vote so that we can see who's with us and who's against us. If they're with us, very nice. We should be grateful to them. If they're against us, however, they will no longer be able to say, oh, yeah, I'm really with you, but it's impossible. It is possible. Put in your vote, and we'll see which side of the issue you're really on, and we'll make sure to vote on this issue next November.
Speaking of next November, you're coming up for re-election. You've only been in office for a short time, taking the place of Carl Kroger in a very, very close election. I think you only won by, less than 20 votes, 13 votes. But
yes.
It was a clear victory. The Russian community is very much behind you, and the rest of the constituency is learning about you very, very, very quickly. It appears that since you come to America and since you've become such an ardent and fervent advocate of things which are representative of everything which America stands for in its best way, that it's not only a matter of pay back, but I think what you even termed is pay forward. What do you mean by pay forward, and what would you like to see now as we move toward November, and what do you think is going to be your agenda between now and then?
Well, let me tell you what I mean by pay forward. I told you about somebody coming in on Pesach and just bringing us food, the first Pesach that we were in the United States, in New York City. I don't know that person. I would never recognize that person anymore. It was 20 years ago, a little more than 20 years ago. I have no way to find that person. That person didn't leave his name, his phone number. I don't know where he lived at the time, much less today. I have no way to thank that person or to pay him back. But there's somebody else there. There's some other 12 or 13-year-old kid who doesn't have the opportunities that they should have, who needs that little bit of food, or who needs that educational help, or who needs whatever help that he needs to someday, so that he someday can be a business owner or a professional, or anyone, whatever he wants to be. That's who I can help. I can find somebody who needs help, even though I can't find somebody who helped me. And that's how I would pay forward. I can't pay back, but I can pay the next generation of people. And not just children, by the way. It could be elderly people who need help. It could be business owners. It could be single mothers. It could be families that can't afford, like I said, education, and so on and so forth. That's what I mean by paying forward. I can't find the people who help me. I can find other people who need help today.
That's quite a goal to aspire to. And We wish you a lot of success with it as we move ahead. And we're very privileged to talk to Senator David Storobin, and we wish you success in the upcoming election, and we're sure we're going to be hearing a lot from you. This is Peretz B. Eichler for Front and Center.